Hi, everyone. My name is Litala Shadotan. Welcome to Hunter's LinkedIn Live. We're going to talk today about the rise of security, data lakes, automation, and why humans will always be a critical part of your SOC. I'm pumped to have Erik Goldman with me. Erik is one of our senior product managers here at Hunters. Erik, you've been in cybersecurity for almost a decade and working on different SOC platforms, SOC solutions for a good few years. Maybe give a little bit background and what you've seen so far.
Yeah, definitely. Started in the cybersecurity space by founding a company called Vanta. Works in the security and compliance space, but it's almost secretly a SIM tool for very small companies that sort of scales up really to focus on compliance, things like SOC 2, HIPAA, PCI for larger companies. So got to see what it was like to kind of work in security with startups, and then went over to Panther, where I led product for them, was the VP of product there for just over a year. And so got to also see kind of how the SOC was evolving. And now over at Hunters, taking kind of a different approach to how SOC should be like how a SIM replacement tool and how a SOC should be working together. And so that's been really exciting.
Excellent. So maybe we start with kind of like the SOC and the technologies that have been serving the SOC for a while. Everybody knows that SIM for the good part of almost 2 decades was the main SOC platform, right? Companies used it for logging of data, for querying the data, for doing the day-to-day. Why shift? What's working? What's not working? Seems are great, right? That they have been serving people for a long time. So should anyone consider shift and why?
Yeah, it's interesting. SIM means different things to different people, I would say. When you really break down what the acronym means, it's relatively mundane. It's like sort of your logging tool. It's a place where your logs are being stored, where they're being processed, where they're available for you to do investigations and threat detection. Now, in practice, when people talk about a SIM, they actually mean, I would say, a relatively narrow set of use cases. And what's gotten, and also bundled, I would say, with a particular technical architecture. And I think what's gotten interesting in the last few years is security teams woke up and realized that they were building in a divergent ecosystem to the rest of their technology partners. So an example would be if you are going and building an analytics system to do web analytics, to do traffic analytics on your site for the purpose of, for example, product management, which is the area that I'm in. No one in 2022 would put that data into something like Splunk. Now, there was an era when they would, when something like Splunk was used for production logging, when it was used for metrics, like product metrics. But really, that industry evolved to start using other technologies like data lakes, data warehousing, right? SQL, tools like that. And security kind of stayed with its tools and its architectures that were born out of this other era where you were running a lot of on-prem software, you were running on a tool that was using kind of older technology built for unstructured logs. So I think what we've seen now is the security community starting to adopt the tools and practices and architectures of these other teams that are handling high data volumes, handling log data, and seeing a lot of success with that. Not only in areas like cost, where something like Snowflake, we can kind of get into the nuances of how that technology works, but where that's enabling them to have better cost models for how they're actually using and storing their data. But it's also enabling them to do much more powerful things with their log data. And so if to call something like that a SIM, for example, or it's a little bit limiting, and it's not really an apples to apples comparison with these older technologies. So I think it's been a really exciting shift. And again, we can kind of get into some of the nuances there, but I think honestly, it's the most interesting thing happening in security right now for me.
So you're thinking that security is actually doing a catch-up game. The rest of the organization shifted to modern data warehousing, and now security is shifting. Other than cost, any other benefits that you see for that shift that is being done?
Yeah, I mean, they're very intertwined. And the reason is, when you're dealing with data volumes as large as you're getting for security logging, you're very limited by what you can effectively afford to do or what you can do in a reasonable amount of time. If you're going to run a query and it's going to take you 20 hours in a legacy SIEM system, that's not suitable to run 4 of those in a day. And once you then start to have the power to reduce the times of those queries or to scale up a warehouse to run a really important investigation in a shorter time period, that enables you to do different things and to work differently as a SOC team. And so, I'd say the biggest trend that I'm seeing in security is the separation of storage and compute using a data lake. It used to be the case that if you were going to store logs from a technical architecture perspective, you were going to put those logs onto a server that was sort of like your laptop or like your computer, where it had a hard drive, it has a processor attached to it, it has RAM, or memory attached to it, and all of those things are bundled together into one machine. And so if you want a bigger hard drive, you're also scaling out your processor or scaling out your memory. And the problem is, for security logging, the modality of using that data is we want to store everything, right? In a perfect world, when it comes time to do an investigation, sitting down and having the network logs for a specific machine on your network, that might be the difference between being able to answer a critical question about whether data was exfiltrated from that machine or not. Now, the decision to log those network effects events had to be made 6, 12, 18, 24 months before, where a team sat down and said, should we log this or not? And those logs might not even be useful for an investigation until they are the critical thing that you have to lean on to complete your investigation. And so the modality of storing and retrieving data for security teams is we want to, in a perfect world, log everything and then decide later whether we need to use it or not. And when you're bundling storage and compute together, that gets very expensive because you are paying for processors attached to your hard drives that are just sitting idle. Because if you're not querying that data, you're paying to rent or to own that processor as well. And the idea of a security data lake is that you are simply paying for the storage space. That storage space is extremely cheap. It's usually on something like an AWS S3, which I actually used to work at Dropbox, which took a significant advantage of AWS S3. We were probably one of the biggest S3 tenants in the world. And it is really dirt cheap. It's hard to beat the pricing on that. It's as close to bulk purchasing of a hard drive as you can get, as close to this cheap of storage as you can get. Now you only start paying for compute when you go to query that data. So that data can sit idle in your security data lake for a year, and it's only when you decide I need this for an investigation that you can pay for compute. And not only that, but you can size your warehouse dynamically. So you can say, this is a somewhat important investigation. Let's put a small warehouse on it. Or you can say, hey, the FBI is at our office looking over my shoulder. We're working on this investigation together. It's time for a triple XL warehouse or a 6XL warehouse to be able to rip through this data really quickly. And so it just gives teams that flexibility to determine what they want to do with the data, how they want to store it, when they want to retrieve it. And because that affects cost, that affects budget, that affects what you can actually log and retrieve and store and query in practice. So, these things are very, very tied together. And that move to the security data lake, I think, is one of the most interesting trends that we've seen in the last few years.
That's excellent. I want to ask something about, should you do it yourself? Should you work with a specific vendor on specifically this part of storing the data? Because as you said, you can just go directly and get yourself S3 buckets and store all the data you want in the world for cheap, I assume you need to put it in a certain format in a way that you can then do the queries, make it usable, because just storing the data doesn't mean the data is usable for analytics, and junk in, junk out sometimes with analytics. So what are your thoughts? And what are your thoughts about what the typical SOC should be doing? Because just saying, let's find the cheapest way to store might not be the smartest way for them. And we'll talk very soon about detection, investigation, response, how to make these things work. I think that the kind of link here, you need to find the format. What is, we call it schema mapping. What is it? And are you going to build it your own? Are you going to do your data engineering, or are you using a third-party vendor to help on that? I want to get your thoughts a little bit.
Definitely. So the build versus buy question comes up quite frequently. And in my last role, it would come up quite a bit because that product was really focused on people who were wanting to code, build things for themselves, kind of do everything from scratch. So a lot of times we'd see potential customers evaluating us versus just building something in-house. And so for me, I went through, with my company Vanta, we went through Y Combinator. And got the lucky enough to speak to Paul Graham, the founder of Y Combinator, and talk to him quite a bit. And he had this term he liked to call it a general schlep for the services that a product offers. And the idea of a general schlep is that first of all, it's general, so many companies are solving the same problem. And second of all, it's a schlep, which is a word we're probably familiar with, which is it's a pain. It takes a lot of time to do, and so when you have a pain that's generalized, that becomes an opportunity for it to be handled by a company and not handled in-house. And so, if really like what that means specifically here is security teams have limited budgets, right? There are teams where adding a little bit extra to a marketing budget, for example, if you're able to see that on the other end in sales, maybe that's an easy way to get justification for that budget. But in security, we're always in the danger of being a cost center, and we always have to fight for budget and use budget as effectively as possible. Now, the more that if we can do more with fewer people, that allows us to have more coverage. It allows us to do more important things that are specific to our business. It allows us to get through that stock queue and that backlog. And if you ultimately are using that budget to recreate something that other companies are doing really well as their specialty, there's an argument that basically you're not using them to look at something else important that's specific to your company. And so when you zoom out and you look at a company like a Snowflake or a Databricks, for example, these are companies that are focused only on building a data lake and a great data lake product. And the more that you dive into what they're building, the more you see how complex and how interesting these tools can be. Everything from data loading to data processing, the complexity there is just so high. And so starting by building on something like a Snowflake or a Databricks, that's going to give you a huge accelerant to your security team. But then once you have that, that's not specific for security. Again, this is a relatively new market for these data lake companies. They've really been focused on things like product analytics, production logging, things like that, IoT logging. Security is relatively new for them. And so out of the box, like you mentioned, they're missing a lot of functionality that would allow you to drop this tool in and start using it with your SOC team. Data modeling is a really easy one. It shouldn't be the case that every single company needs to figure out, okay, how do I map this CrowdStrike data onto a generalized schema about EDRs? How do I separate signal from noise in these logs so I can say, hey, show me all the authentication events for this user? Even just connecting to all of those APIs, transforming them, right? The integrations involved there. And on sort of the product analytics side, we see tools like a Fivetran, for example, doing that ETL, doing that transformation for customers. Now, that is a large and quickly growing company that's very valuable because they solve this general schlep problem. Every product team wants to pull in data, transform it, normalize it in a certain way. Well, that's what we're seeing with these security tools just on the ingestion part. And that's everything from on-prem logging health monitoring, data transformation, right? All of these are really tricky problems. Some of them are companies in and of themselves, and rebuilding them company by company in every single security team. Like, you zoom out and you see that as a general schlep. And the pitch I give is, I can take all those engineers, all those security analysts, and redirect them to problems that are very specific to your company, thinking about security issues, security monitoring that doesn't apply to the company next to you. And another example I give is detection writing. There's no need for every company to write SolarWinds IOC monitoring for themselves. That comes out, we have it, we can one-click deploy it. We can, for example, at Hunters, we have an excellent research team. They're able to very quickly jump on this and deploy it to all of our customers in a single button click. There's no need for every customer to duplicate that work internally. So the security data lake from a technical perspective is just that starting point. You can see all the functionality that should be built on top of it. And to me, it's just a very clear general schlep. Like, take your limited budget and apply it to the other projects you have on your list. Don't try to reinvent the wheel here.
I love it, and I totally agree. It's all about the expertise. Keep for your teams the focus on the work that is really unique to your store, right? If you're building your own software, you want to have them really look at what's unique to you versus probably 80% of threats, 80% of your environment that is identical to everyone else in the market. A vendor should be covering that, so free up the time for you to focus on what's unique to you. You mentioned detection, so let's talk about that. If you're using a modern data lake like Snowflake, Databricks, or alikes, what are the analytics capabilities that you want to have for better detection, better investigation, to enable faster response? What is it? Obviously, you want integrations and APIs, but there are some modern capabilities that are very different than what people have in maybe traditional SIEMs, maybe even the more up-to-date SIEMs, which offer UEBA. Let's touch about that and what the expectations people should be looking at.
Yep. Yeah, I think one of the interesting trends I've seen is a move from what I would call scheduled reporting, where you're writing a query, you're running it on some regular basis, you're kind of analyzing the results, into real-time detection and response, where each log line is coming into the system, and we are using basically detection logic that's effectively stateless. You're able to take that data, notify in real time, and even sometimes now with the rise of tools like SOAR, start to triage and remediate them using some rudimentary automation. And I think that's been really cool and really exciting for a lot of teams, starting to look at things like simple machine learning to do things like anomaly detection. I think that's also a really fascinating area. You have, for example, somebody using a support tool. They're looking at people's profiles or looking at information about a company. Well, that's part of their normal day-to-day work. But now you have one support agent that's looking at 10x as many profiles in a day, right? That may be an indication that they've been compromised and that they're clicking around in your support portal is actually data exfiltration. But done cleverly, it's really hard to separate that signal from the noise without having some sort of anomaly detection or data roll-ups where things get a little bit more sophisticated. And so there's a whole space of, again, what you can do when you free up headspace on your team to start looking specifically at your security needs and what you want to go and build. And so it's this pairing of what I would call sort of generic detections. So you're on CrowdStrike, you see a file hash being run that's connected to an IOC, something like that. That is going to apply to every company. But then you have maybe nuances about your own support portal that you want to encode in one of these SOC platforms. That's an area where these tools can basically help you, give you a really curated environment where you can sit down and write something simple to be able to detect behaviors. Again, using some even relatively advanced tooling like machine learning, and making that really simple for you and your team.
So we're moving from this big organizations building detection engineering on top of SIEM to things you're going to get out of the box more, I assume. How is it relevant across the whole environment? Is there an advantage over there? Because obviously there are a lot of tools, network, identity, endpoint. What's the challenges you see with traditional SIEMs versus when you move to, more SOC platform like Hunters?
Yeah, definitely. There are a lot of tools, and that's something that we hear all the time from customers, that basically training analysts to understand all these tools is very, very difficult. You already have people coming in, different levels of experience, a lot of different cloud tools. Log formats are a constant challenge for security analysts. Where naively you'd say, oh, it's relatively simple. If I wanted to look this up or that up, it's all in the logs. But in practice, you say, okay, I want to see what a failed login in this tool looks like. Well, you want to check that the error code is X or Y, and then you want to see that the event type is this, or it could be that, or it actually could be this third type, right? And then you want to see this other thing. And eventually you realize the complexity where each analyst needs to understand each log format really, really clearly to be able to do their job. And I think a lot of what these SOC platforms can do to help is take these common log formats, start to normalize them, make them really, really easy for analysts to use, but still retain a lot of that power to do. Like if I asked you, hey, I want you to write a detection for credentials that haven't been rotated in AWS, that involves quite a bit of reading the documentation for these AWS logs to understand where these values even are. And I think what we can do as a SOC platform is just make that really, really easy for analysts to be able to sit down and translate what they have in their head into effectively SQL. But perhaps not even using that. Not all analysts are trained in SQL. That's a relatively new requirement for them, or a new idea for them to be in terms of learning that. So I think a lot of what SOC platforms can do here, where SIEMs have a little bit more challenge, is better data normalization, better schema management, better handling of large data volumes, and then also something I see is cross correlation. So being able to, for example, normalize data not just within one log source, but across multiple log sources. And that gets really interesting because one thing that I think is super cool about Hunters in particular is our ability to connect leads across stories. So you have a computer that's doing something that we find potentially malicious. Then you have an employee doing something that we might find potentially malicious. Again, coming back to an example, like in a support portal, for example, connecting the identity of that employee on the support portal, which could be in a proprietary username or Okta or a tool like that, to their computer, which might be managed in something like CrowdStrike with a relatively opaque CrowdStrike agent ID. That as you start to dive into in practice what it takes to do a lot of this work, you realize it is beyond the scope of what a lot of security analysts are able to do without effectively building their own SaaS platform. So that's what I'm really excited about with these SOC platforms, is it just makes it really easy to, for example, connect and normalize all this data and present it to the analyst in a way where it's already a bit like pre-digested, like all the hard part, all the normalization, that's done for them. And they can just start to ask questions of the person, of their laptop, rather than of the log itself, where things start to get really confusing. And we've seen with our customers this huge increase in power for what their analysts are able to accomplish because of what we're able to do for them as a SOC platform.
What I love about the normalization part, the way that it gives freedom to organizations and to IT to seamlessly change the stack if they want to. So if you're going from being an AWS, you add another cloud service, you add Azure, or you add Google Cloud. Or if you're going to change from Okta to another authentication service, not needing to recode all your detection in your SIEM, to plug in the ability to see whatever you have in your environment, the ability to keep on your detection going on as you go and change. I think this is what organizations are looking for. I mean, we all know we're switching vendors quickly. We want to save costs, sometimes the efficiencies, sometimes we want to be in a multi-cloud environment for redundancy and other reasons. But this is all adding such a huge complexity. If your SOC need to now bring in new capabilities, knowing how to read those logs, knowing how to normalize them. This is insane with the complexity of our environments. So I love this approach that basically whatever you plug in, it's normalized, it serves into the detection schema. It works together regardless of what's the sources of data. And I think that's the approach that we should have these days. Let the IT do whatever is good for your organization, use whatever tools. Security will be applied on top of it and will serve you.
That's exactly right. And I think that's what's, we're seeing basically teams that are able to dictate their own tools in a much more distributed way now, which is great because you're on a marketing team, you're on IT, you're an engineer, and you reach for a tool that's really going to accelerate your team's ability to execute. It's a lot more of distributed decision making than it used to be there. And so people are able to pull in the tools that they need to use to get their job done. The flip side to that, though, is it means security analysts have to play catch up, right? You wake up one day, there's a new tool in your environment, or you're trained on AWS, and all of a sudden, like you said, maybe your company is moving to multi-cloud, and now you need to understand Azure and be able to feel like you're securing that cloud environment. The best thing I think that those teams can do is, again, like anything in that general schlep, like how do I secure Azure? There are just good, sane baselines for that, good, sane things to monitor. And then once that's out of the way, now how much can we treat it as sort of a generic EDR, or generic cloud vendor, or generic identity system, and to be able to write detections against it, again, without really needing to know all the details. Oh, in Azure, if you want to look at this event, you're going to need to look at these properties, and then this thing is actually there, and there's a gotcha because these two logs are actually the same log type, but with this subtle difference in there. That's all context you're going to have your entire security analyst team trained on, unless there's a normalization layer in front of it. So yeah, I think that's really exciting. And I love the idea that we can accelerate people to a really powerful baseline on day one, and then they can choose how much further they want to go to the organizational specific risks that they want to build into their SOC platform.
How do you see the future? What's the vision that the SOC is going towards? You've been in this industry for such a long time, worked with so many different teams. What's up? What's next?
Yeah, definitely. So, for me, what I think is most interesting is I want to see us leveraging humans for what humans do best and offloading all the other work that they're trying to do. And even the move from a lot of these legacy SIEM products to these next gen SIEM products, these SOC platform products, that's an amazing step in the right direction. And people are sometimes asking, oh, does this replace the analyst, or does this cause tension with them? But for me, I don't think people went into security because they wanted to debug a Splunk indexer that crashed at 3 a.m. because it ran out of memory. That's not why people went into the security industry. This is a responsibility they've had to take on because of on-prem software, cloud technologies that don't scale elastically, not being able to separate storage and compute historically. And so they've needed to take on this entire set of responsibility that doesn't really relate to security. And so if we can start just by offloading that IT burden or that management burden by moving those tools into the cloud, if we can remove the burden of like deeply understanding all these proprietary log formats and all these different tools into something that's generalized and makes sense for an analyst, if we can remove the burden of just getting an environment like AWS up to a reasonable security baseline, so you can start to layer on company specific risks on top of it. I think what we're doing here is we're focusing the limited resources of those analysts onto the problems that actually matter, and taking anything that's a general schlep and sort of moving it off of them. And again, that includes even relatively sophisticated things, matching an employee in as a username in AD across all these machines with a local login. Like, that is serious data work. But if we can do that in an automated way and just present the results to the analysts so they can start to write detections or run investigations on it, we're focusing the work of those security analysts as much as possible. And so that's, I think, what I'm most excited about. I think we even see that in SOAR, where you're saying, look, we're seeing the same detections fire over and over again. We have a triage process that we have reduced to effectively an algorithm. First, do this. If we see this, do it this way. If we don't see it, go this direction. Can we take those and push that into a SOAR platform? And so the only things that land on the desk of the analysts are these interesting or exceptional cases. Not because we're trying to replace that analyst, but because we can make them more effective by taking all the easy calls and moving them off their plate entirely. So now their day is filled with all the interesting cases instead of all the data. And I'm seeing that trend across the SOC, basically. And I think it's a great trend. Security teams are often, they don't have the budget that they wish that they had. They often don't have the personnel that they wish they had, or the training that they wish that they had. And so the more that we can leverage their limited resourcing, I think the better we all sleep at night, knowing that we're addressing the risks that are particular to a given business. And I think we're going to see that trend over the next few years as people move onto these SOC platform tools and away from legacy SIEM.
I love it, because I think the industry is full of stressful assignments, right? Being in a SOC is a very stressful assignment. And the more people do the not mundane, but the interesting, fun, the intellectually challenging work that the machine cannot do, and let the machine do the mundane things that are just keep you going, the busybody work that we all have to do because that's part of the job, I think satisfaction will be up, and we're all going to help solve a little bit this problem of people in the SOC being stressed, unhappy, being part of this big resignation that we all hear about. So I think this is definitely where if we think about the people and we care about them, this is where the technology should help the problem.
Yeah. I would even say sometimes I feel like the task or the goal of a security team is, as stated, almost impossible, where their scope is so large. They need to be monitoring, for example, you talked about usage of an internal support tool and making sure that's not abused. They need to look out for HR issues between employees, for example. They need to be able to run investigations. They need to be able to look at IOCs. They basically are looking across the entire organization for any risk at all. And in a perfect world, people would maybe go to security before they did anything and say, hey, am I allowed to do this? Am I allowed to do that? And they could analyze that for risk. But more and more autonomy is going to the individual employee now. And I think correctly, it's allowing businesses to move really fast. If you're on a small marketing team and you need a marketing tool to do your job, it used to be the case that you'd have this long procurement process. You'd work with IT to install it on the server that was running in your closet, right? And that was firewalled and they understood it. Now that marketing team can put down a corporate credit card and potentially put important data into that system, perhaps without even telling anybody that it's happening. Whether we want that to be happening or not, we're seeing that trend accelerating. And so the security team has a mission of basically monitoring everything and preventing risk across the entire company. And on the other side, we're allowing individuals in the company to have more autonomy than they've ever had before. And so the combination of those two factors makes the security job, I think, particularly difficult right now. And the best we can do is just say, all right, we're not going to be able to ask teams to, ask for permission before they do anything, but we can get them to log everything. And if we can get them to log everything, we can start to monitor for things that might worry us. And if we can monitor for things that worry us, now we can start to direct the attention of our limited analyst team across the sort of unlimited areas of risk in the business. But it is going to be impossible to win in that fight without automation, without companies stepping in to solve these general schlep problems. And I think that's a trend that's ultimately going to benefit both the security team, but also the individuals at a company.
Absolutely. Well, I want to remind everyone that is watching this LinkedIn Live, if you have questions, Erik and I will be available to answer them when this call is over. So please write them in the chat box down in the thread. We'll be happy to answer you, and other people from Hunters will chime in and answer your questions. Erik, any last thoughts before we finish here?
I just think it's a really exciting time to be working in security. I've been really, really enjoying how quickly this industry has been moving, even in the last like 3-4 years. And really excited about what we're building here to make security not only accessible to everybody, but really improve the lives of the analysts. So it's been super cool, and yeah, been love working on product over at Hunters.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us today, Erik. It's been a pleasure. Hope that everybody enjoyed. We're here to answer your questions. So thanks for posting, and hope to see you all again. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.